Greetings, gumshoes, and welcome to another episode of Silver Screen Sleuths. My name is Emily Edwards, and I am here today with TV writer and award-winning novelist of 2022's Other People's Secrets and the incredible, if you have not read it yet, 2025 hit She's a Lamb, Meredith Hambrock. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? That was such a good. This is my first thing that I've done since I won a prize. So
Since you won, I feel like from A Christmas Story, it's a major award. Like, congratulations! It's so cool, and you're so well deserving.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, man, it's like waiting for this stuff is so hard. So I'm just feeling a mixture of happiness and also just like a smidge of relief. Just the waiting is over.
Like, even when you lose, you're just kind of like, oh, thank God, that's over. But you won.
I know. I feel like in like 3 months, I'll be like, wow, I won.
Yeah. You get to slip that into conversations with people you don't like from now on. It's going to be great.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes.
But if you haven't picked up She's a Lamb, I read it literally in one sitting. It's one of the most intense, incredible books I've ever read. Like, it's such a feat, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with me on this goofy little show.
I love to goof, believe me. I know it's a real dark comedy of a book, but people always are surprised who know me. They're like, what? Like, you're not, this is not you at all. But yeah,
crap. No, I don't want to be alone in an elevator with you.
I feel like most crime writers I've met are like this though. Like you meet them in person and they're just like funny and insightful and goofy and lighthearted, and they save all of the darkness for their work.
Yeah, definitely. Like, after I wrote a couple of things that were really, really dark, people are like, Emily, you're the most Connecticut person I've ever met. And it's just like, yeah, I know, but
Read the news. Yeah.
Exactly. It's what we think about, and then we're polite to your face.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to say, you are also the co-host of an incredible podcast that I have been listening to that is wonderfully helpful for anybody who does actually write, even if you're new or old or established. Can you tell us a little bit about the Novel Writers?
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm the co-host of the Novel Writers podcast with Brianna Labuscus, who she writes commercial thrillers, and I write more literary leaning thrillers. It's just sort of how we are pitched by our agent, basically. And so we thought getting together to talk about craft and to have a podcast for writers solely focused on writing, different craft topics would be just a great way to fight I always feel like there's a huge, especially now, emphasis on like publishing industry chatter, and this helped me fight that. And Brie is also just like she's so talented, and she also is really talented historical fiction novelist, and she really, was like, there really is no one way to write a book. And so we really like to bring that perspective into our conversations about craft and share that with folks in a way that is, free, accessible, and fun, hopefully.
No, it's really fantastic. It's one of those things where I did sort of study writing in my bachelor's degree, but I was really focused on the publishing aspect, because in 2003 to 2007, when I graduated, they were like, the only way you're ever going to make money in the world if you're writers, if you go into publishing. And it turns out there's no money in that either, because the magazine industry folded the second I walked across that stage with my diploma. But but I do think you're right that so much of the chatter on social media right now is very much, and in the community, because that's the main place where most people turn to the community of writers, is like, well, if you just crack this one marketing tip, then you're going to get published and you make $1 bajillion. And it's like, no, you do actually also have to know what it's like to write a book and how difficult it is and all the different elements of it that fan together.
Absolutely. I think there's this, I also love industry chit chat, so I don't want to be too hard on that side of it. It's fun and addictive, and because the industry of publishing is so opaque, and so pulling back the veil on that, I think is totally worthwhile. But at the same time, Brie and I are of this sort of same belief that if you just write a really great book, it'll find its audience, more often than not. And we're really just proponents of focusing on that side of it and growing in craft. And I know it can be such a frustrating and heartbreaking industry, but
that's very true.
Yeah, it's almost like the only way to cope sometimes is to really just focus on what you can control, which is writing a really great book.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that is the thing that I try to do to inspire myself. And, She's a Lamb was a novel that is a little odd. And it was a little odd in its pitch. It's about a frustrated actress who she's like desperate to be Maria in The Sound of Music, but she can't get cast. And so she takes a job as a childminder, and then she just sort of decides she's going to be Maria. And it's sort of a thriller. It's sort of has some horror elements to it. It's a dark comedy. It has like kind of intense psychological narration, but it's also funny. Like it struggled to find a niche, but I think the fact that it didn't fit into a niche kind of helped it find readers who were super passionate about it. So, I mean, I was lucky that we have a great independent publisher in Canada named ECW Press that kind of, they, took a shot on it. I had a great editor and then an awesome team of people who were excited to promote it. And so like that all really, really helped, but like it's so different from the big five. And I attribute a lot of the success of that book to readers and also just to following my own almost like naive.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
A great book, even if it wasn't, a perfect fit for publishing.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But no, that's actually really an excellent segue into talking about the TV show that, or really a miniseries that you chose to talk about for the show today, which is Mare of Easttown, which, we were chatting a little bit before we started recording, which was like, oh, we forgot how bleak this is. And we forgot how almost like oppressively unhopeful it can be. And honestly, I think it's a completely almost genre busting sort of 7 hours of television because it does not, ever try to fit itself into the Law and Order or Columbo or, even the sort of Pretty Little, oh my gosh, like the thriller. It's not a thriller. It's not a police procedural. It's not a mystery. It's just a beautiful, beautiful, like crime focused miniseries. That was a little meandering, but
No,
we'll get there.
absolutely. I mean, like the lead is a detective, but it does break down. I think it sort of ignores some of the sort of traditional tropes of like a detective story and is intensely character focused and is focused on the interior life of the lead character, which I found to be like really, really fascinating. And I think what really drew people to it and what kind of kept people invested in it throughout all the bleakness, because the specificity really, it almost felt like you were watching real life unfold. So it's like set in a small town, I think in Pennsylvania, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And I don't know a ton. I'm Canadian, so I like my American geography is not great, but it has like this almost, you said oppressive bleakness, and I think a lot of the sort of oppressive feeling comes from the lead detective is Mare, and she, works for the police, and she is intensely socially interconnected to like everybody in town. Like everybody knows her. They call her on her personal cell phone all the time. They sort of ignore,
Yeah.
the normal procedural police stuff just because they've known Mare her entire life, kind of for better or for worse. And there's some really, like darkly funny moments. There's like at one point she arrests a suspect who's I think teenage girl or recently graduated teenage girl who had assaulted a young woman who dies in the first episode, and they have that on video. And so she arrests this teenage girl at work because she's kind of a bully, and Mare is like, I want to teach her a lesson. She's kind of fired up about it too.
Asshole.
And, so then she has this big blow up with the girl's parents who own this restaurant because she's coming into the restaurant. She's embarrassing them. And then they come to her house later, I think, and like the dad is screaming at her and like something happens. And then the mom kind of apologizes and Mare's mom comes outside and she's like, you want a beer? You want to come in for a drink? So we get a sense that like we're almost watching like a family drama unfold with all of these people who are so interconnected in their relationships, which added this like layer of complexity to this series and this mystery that I don't think anyone had really ever seen before, or at least, it like to this extent.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm from Connecticut, so it's very close to Pennsylvania, but I don't know Pennsylvania very much at all. There's a definite delineation between like the New England states, and then Pennsylvania is often basically treated as though it's kind of its own thing. The state sort of cultures can be very, very disparate, even though we're all crammed together in a tiny little space. And I really do appreciate how much the writer of this show, one writer who created it his name is Brad Inglesby. And it wasn't based on a book. It wasn't based on a novel. It's a television show that he pitched and wrote the whole thing. He really dedicated to capturing that extremely sort of upper, lower class, lower middle class divide that happens in a lot of places, but most people don't think that actually exists in the Northeast of the United States. I have run into a lot of people who think that everybody who lives in the Northeast is just some magically wealthy, waspish, has a sailboat, goes, is shortlisted to go to Yale, like that kind of mentality. And it's like, no, a lot of that area is old mill towns. If there was a river running through your town, it means your town once made I grew up in a town that made hats and it didn't have any economy. Once hats were like literally the town didn't vote Democrat for like 60 years because JFK made hats unfashionable and the town collapsed on itself. I'm
Oh my
not
God,
even
laugh. That's
joking.
funny. Hats are just sort of inherently kind of funny.
It's hilarious, but it's like
Yeah.
JFK stopped wearing hats in the 1960s and my town stopped voting Democrat. Like that's that town. And you're just like, you don't think that those things exist in places where it's like, oh, in Philadelphia, where, the Philadelphia story and Katharine Hepburn is so well known for playing like these rich, rich people. And it's like, no, there's just, broke ass struggling people everywhere. And Inglesby captured that unbelievable struggle so well. It's like they're not on the verge of being destitute or homeless or being unable to feed their kids. It's just life isn't easy and they know it.
Totally. And I think what was something that was quite brave about this work is that I think he really dove headfirst into showing what I feel is a fairly accurate portrayal of how the opioid crisis has changed
Yes.
pounds of working class and low income Americans, I think, in a very heartbreaking and raw and sometimes terrifying way. I think we see 3 plot lines maybe of that are influenced by the opioid crisis. She, currently in the story, she has a friend. Mare has a good friend whose brother has addiction issues and is sort of her friend is dealing with that kind of conflict, full on. I mean, it complicates the mystery for Mare. And then we learn later on that Mare's son had was also suffering from addiction. And we see some truly terrifying scenes of what that was like for her. And then we also see Mare's son had a son, and so she has her grandson at home. The mother of her grandson has recently been released from prison, I think, and is now in recovery and is trying to regain custody of her son. And Mare sort of has to learn to forgive her for all of the things that happened, when her son was still alive. I think those are the main, and then we sort of meet some sex workers who I think, sometimes are in and out of, opioid use as well and how that impacts them. So there's a full, I think, rich, honest, gritty understanding of this heartbreaking type of drug and the impact that it has on folks in these towns and, why some of them almost are forced to use it to, but also how they sort of mention at one point there's a young woman who got struck by a vehicle. And she was put on an opioid and then immediately, when she was trying to recover from being struck by a vehicle, kind of became addicted to it. And it kind of, I think, was a great way to just show that it could happen to anybody. To really help us, I think, build empathy kind of outside of, because they're showing such violent scenes sometimes between Mare and her son when he was in the throes of addiction. And also, I think it's, he had some fairly large mental health issues that influenced it, but it tried to really show a full picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of fictional depictions of addiction, especially through the lens of crime, because, we so thoroughly, have made any sort of access to addiction counseling or addiction treatment through the penal system in America. You have to get arrested for it basically in order to, unless you're extremely wealthy and can afford to, pay off the courts and go to private addiction counseling. But I think this show does such an excellent job of removing the lens of criminality through it, even though Mare is a cop, and she has been she's a cop. That's what she's specialized. She's moved up through the ranks. She's not a beat cop. She is a detective. She is fairly high up in the station, but they do a really excellent job of removing almost like the sexy, violent appeal of being involved in drugs. Oftentimes in Gritlit, you read, but it's like there's never anybody who is involved in narcotics or involved in addiction who doesn't know how to use a knife and fight, and it's just like, oh, they're working their way up, or they're going to get taken out by the drug lord. And that's like this our whole war on drugs concept of what drugs do to America. And really it's just, no, people get addicted and it's sad and their families miss them, and it can be violent, it can lead to violence, but more often than not, it's just the heartbreak of it is so much better captured in this show than almost any other show I think I've ever seen that's tackled the opioid addiction crisis.
Yeah, like absolutely. And I think like one of my favorite beats of this story, I'm calling it favorite is, it's tough because it's so
Yeah.
sad, but something that I thought was like really empathetic. And I love that Mare sort of has this character arc of, growing to, in her own way, try to, emotionally kind of forgive the mother of her grandson. As she comes out of, she's in recovery for addiction and she gets multiple jobs, and she's so exhausted at the multiple jobs that she has to work in order to
Yeah.
claw her way out of this, that she ends up using drugs again just to try to stay awake so that she can potentially get custody of her son back, because she has to be able to provide a home for him. But like, how do you
Exactly.
do that when when your wages, you're working a minimum wage job and, just sort of desperately, trying to like pull it back together again. So it showed, I think, the oppressive weight of like capitalism, and maybe makes a subtle argument for support and forgiveness
Absolutely.
for folks as well. So yeah, very, very powerful when you really start kind of breaking
Yeah.
down the way that those storylines develop.
And I think one of the things that, you used a word quite a number of times earlier when you were discussing just like the setting of it. You kept saying like, oh, everybody knows her and everybody knows Mare and everybody knows. And I think it really, this show does an absolutely wonderful job of playing with the concept of like the terror of being known by people. The absolute, everybody knows your dirty laundry in these tiny little towns. The real life towns that this show is based off of are anywhere between 3 and 13,000 people. That's nothing. Those are teeny tiny little towns. Everybody knows you. You marry people that you went to high school with, or you don't marry them and you have children with them, and then they all go to high school together. And it's just this incredible lack of privacy that comes with this. And I think that's such an interesting setting for mystery fiction. And I'm not sure if necessarily the show was set out to be a mystery, more of like a crime sort of, but there is such a strong whodunit factor too, is just Caily Spaeny plays a little girl who's murdered in the very first episode, and you just want to find out who did it and why. So you do have that whodunit foundation. And normally, when you're talking about small town whodunits, it's always very cozy. Oh, it's just an outsider coming through, or the silly little secrets that the cozy characters have. But these are real, true, honest to God, like real life secrets that the writer has so much sympathy for, and he does such an excellent job of making that poor little girl who dies in the first episode just having the most bleak, unhopeful existence while she's still excited to go on a date. And to the emotional balance that they managed to strike throughout this is wonderful, because Mare is known and she's terrified that everybody knows all of her embarrassing things, and that everybody knows her ex-husband is re-engaged to another woman before, she knows. And she's terrified that all these people know her dirty little secrets, but she insists on being there for everyone. And you're just like, the emotional balance of that is terrifying. No wonder she's exhausted all the time.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they set up her character so well, because she was a teenage. So Mare was the captain of her high school basketball team, and I think like they call her the Lady Hawk, I think,
Yeah.
and she had this buzzer shot, I think,
Yeah.
that won, right? Like this
Yes,
is
she won the national championship, or the state championship, not national, state, 25 years ago. That's the
yes,
best thing
and
that's ever happened to this sad little town.
I know, and like she carries that I think this feeling of like heroism, and like almost like chasing that identity of like
Mhm.
needing to be the hero. And it is almost, there's some meditations on this as well. We see through our understanding of her relationship with her father, who was also a detective for, or a policeman. I'm not sure which one, but she sort of tried to follow in his footsteps. And he eventually succumbed to suicide. And then later on, there is sort of another plot line of this other detective named Zabel, who talks a little
Mhm.
bit about the heroic side of this job as well. And we sort of learn and see what we're shown, I think, is that there really isn't much celebration or joy in the heroic act
Yeah.
of, helping people in this town, and in how she acts as a police officer. So that it is very like oppressive and difficult. And then at the end, we do see her, like, I think, make like a very difficult choice as well, which was very interesting. And I had to really think about the ending a little bit.
Yeah.
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 There's a twist ending. There's several twists at the end. And we basically, it's sort of, we think that it's Mare's, best friend's husband who has killed the young woman who dies in the pilot episode. But then we actually learn that it was Mare figures out kind of at the very, very end, like at the, 11th hour, that it was actually the son, who is 13 or 12, maybe,
Yeah.
like very,
I
very
think
young.
he's like 13, I think. So it's just like just on the cusp of when people are really gonna start to throw the book at kids in America, especially. Like, it's not unheard of for 13-year-olds to be tried as adults here, which is absolutely repugnant and disgusting, but it's something our justice system does.
Yeah, and I was, like, curious about this choice. Like, I thought about it a lot after and I don't know a lot about young offenders in the United States and how that plays out, but I think it was just, like, a very interesting character moment for her, because Mare obviously lost her own son,
Mhm.
and so she kind of is forced with, making this choice. Do I let my friend, who is a mother, like, get away with it? Or
Yeah.
do I, and, like, let the son get away with it? Or does he, should he suffer the consequences of his actions? And she ends up choosing to go and arrest the son, which
Mhm.
ultimately, I do think was the right move, like, because we see the weight on the son's conscience throughout the show. We see him sort of acting out, and we see he's emotionally not holding it very well, which makes a lot of sense. And then at the end, we do see Mare ended up having to sort of try to reconcile with her friend and support her emotionally.
Yeah.
And she does that, and I thought it was very, very, like, a very moving and perfect and messy ending. What did you
Yeah.
think?
No, I completely agree. I was curious for a little bit of the runtime of that episode of, the first time I saw it, of whether or not they were going to let this husband or this father sacrifice himself for his young son. And again, 13 is such a is a pointed age for that to be happening, because there have been a number of children, predominantly not white children, tried as adults at that age. 13 is a little bit more, when you're a white boy, is a little bit more of, oh, he has so much promise, that standard sort of phrasing that we the justice system uses so frequently here. So it is a very specific, but they're not wealthy. They are not from a connected family. They are not in a connected town. So it could really go either way. And I was really actually very pleased, you know, I was relieved with the decision that she decided to, essentially charge the child and tell the truth of the conclusion of the investigation. Because I think there's something to be said for 13-year-olds not understanding the gravity of the situation that they've created. I think that's the main reason why most of us would, say that a 13-year-old is still a child and should be considered a child in the eyes of the court of the law. And the death sentence that would have been given to that family if they had lost the income of a father who had to go to jail, how he would never work again because of how we treat people who come out of prison. Juvenile records are sealed by and large, and you don't have to disclose them as much on future job applications. Things like that. I think it really took into account all the different socioeconomic ramifications of, certainly a father's love trying to sacrifice himself to atone for his child's own behavior is a beautiful sentiment. but whether or not that beautiful sentiment is warranted, it's so complicated. Like,
Because he also did something really awful in that he was having a relationship with, like, his
his
niece,
niece.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had fathered the child and put all this pressure on her and put her in these situations that I think, led to, I mean, there were a lot of, a lot of situational stuff that led to her being murdered by the son of the
Hmm.
father, but
Yeah.
he's definitely not let off the hook. But I also found in the ending there's sort of a argument made by a priest who he had a conviction for having I think he had sexually assaulted a young woman,
Yes.
and he had
Yeah.
been
An
moved
underage.
to this it's a very dark show, but he
Yeah.
had moved to this and he had been moved to this town and was sort of facing, like, street justice for that from people when the news leaked. And his first kind of the show ends on this, his last kind of, I forget what it's called, like he's a sermon.
A
He's
sermon. Yeah.
yeah, he's providing a sermon at church, and he almost makes an argument for forgiveness as like a survival strategy. As
Right.
like, we have to live with one another. Like, this is the truth of where we are, and we have to find a way to live with one another, otherwise we won't make it.
Hmm.
And that was like a profoundly interesting take on forgiveness that I hadn't heard before.
Pretty, like, I grew up Catholic, and so in a very similar sort of church environment. Trust me, the bishop involved in my diocese was not a nice man who moved lots of terrible people around New England. And so to have that again confronted just bald facedly on this show is very brave, and to just make no bones about it. But it is such a central tenet of Catholicism that, like, everything will be made better if if you practice forgiveness. And I think that the show really does an excellent job, again, as well, of just saying, like, no, actually, you're allowed to hold a grudge in your heart, because, the calcification that you put over your own heart sometimes is also a way to protect yourself. And it shouldn't get as thick as Mare's is, but it does have to be there when you're sort of in dire circumstances. Even the first episode where her friend's brother breaks into her house and steals her kids' trophies to sell them for money to buy narcotics. And she's just like, no, I'm not letting him back in my house. I'm not solving this problem. For the first time, I can't be the person who bails him out. And you're just like, thank God you find, we always get told in therapy, you have to put up boundaries. And then to have at the end, just people go like, oh no, you have to practice forgiveness. And it's like, no, this whole entire show is actually a wonderful argument for essentially the women who on this basketball team up from 25 years ago, who have now grown up to learn and say, like, you don't have to be everybody's hero. You only have to take care of yourself and your children. That's okay to say that, like, you're not going to let your addicted brother sleep on the couch anymore. It's, he's his own man.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Like, it's very, I think this whole series, I think, like, on the surface, you would say it's about grief, but I think you're right. It's more so about how hard it is to forgive and how, like, easy it is to just say, oh, you should forgive someone, but how difficult that process is.
Yeah.
What does it do to you if you can't forgive someone? But also, how do you survive in the face of that kind of the sort of demands of the world that are in your reality, that are sort of forcing these horrible things at your
Yeah.
feet all the time? And I really love, yeah, you're right, that they really dove into just like how terribly hard it is, especially when, yeah, life is sort of churning around in the way that it did.
Yeah, I think it does such a wonderful job of a lot of crime fiction. We write stories where people are wronged in the worst possible manner. Someone you love gets murdered, or someone you love does the murdering, and we're people who write these books. We think a lot about justice and what is appropriate justice and what is appropriate punishment. When does justice go over into vengeance? Like, what is the healthy way of dealing with people who have hurt you? And I really just truly think that this show does such an excellent job of multi-generational dealing with hurt and anger. I think that the decision to make a huge part of the cast to be teenagers who are on the cusp of adulthood but don't yet have the skills or the calcifications around their heart to be adults is, but they're dealing with adult situations. You've got little kids with babies, and they have not only can fully functional adults not make a living, how can a 17-year-old with a 1-year-old make a living? How do you deal with that? The show does it without ever being saccharine or too angry. At no point is it ever assumed that these little kids are going to have a great life one day. But it's also just not ever resorting to, and everything's hopeless, so why even live? It balance is really wonderful. That frustration between like, I want the fantasy and I want nihilism. It's one, often in media it's portrayed as one or the other. And this really strikes an excellent tone right down the middle.
Yeah, you're right. I do think that there is kind of like sometimes in like really heavy noir stories that come from, people who write maybe outside of their experience a little bit, a feeling that like people in low income places are like miserable and their
Yeah.
lives
Yes.
are
Yes.
miserable and they never get to be happy and like all they feel is pain and that turns them angry or whatever. But I do think you're right. It does show like some great moments of humanity, kids being excited, like there's a queer love story kind of at the heart of it, which is really heartwarming and kind of funny at times. It's
Yeah.
almost like comic relief in a few moments. There's like a young woman excited to go on a date. There's and there is like Mare's ex-husband is getting, it's very much in the background, but and at first we're sort of, kind of on Mare's side where she's dreading it and kind of acting badly about her ex-husband remarrying, but then it kind of becomes like a nice sort of happy ending almost for them
Yeah.
as a whole kind of mixed, blended, odd family who can spend time together and have a drink and celebrate and be happy. So
Yeah.
that part is really nice. I want to kind of go back to what you said about justice, because when crime fiction really, I grew to understand crime fiction in a like deeper way when I read this quote that Attica Locke said, I think, and it's like that crime fiction is about the fantasy of justice.
Yeah.
And I
I
actually
love
don't
that.
know if in Mare of Easttown's case that is like 100% true, because like there is, I think, a sense of justice here in that like we find out, some young women who have been kidnapped get saved and they go on to have nice lives and they're supported by their communities and the mysteries are solved. But I think what we're left with is just the real human consequences of like how awful these crimes were and sort of what they do to a community. And so we almost don't get that sense at the end. But I do think it does end on this sort of like bittersweet, almost like hopeful note, which is just like that there are like seasons to life.
Yeah.
And we as a community kind of like, again, going back to that sermon, which I thought was like a very kind of powerful moment for the show, talking about forgiveness as a survival tactic and learning how to navigate that in such a treacherous and layered and difficult way, but also just that, we'll go through hard times and we'll go through good times,
Yeah.
which I know
Yeah.
is like, it kind of feels a little silly to say that, but there is sort of a moment of like, kind of like relief, and they show it in
Yeah.
the filmmaking, like it's like very like bright and yellow in the in the shots, and there's like less sort of dark tones, and
Yeah.
they're very thoughtful about how they portrayed it to show that there's a season, and hopefully our people get some peace for a little while.
I think I was thinking that we're all the way back to the first episode. She arrests her friend's brother who's broken into her house, and she asks her friend, do you want to press charges? And she's like, no. But I think Mare has a really interesting view on the role of policing in her own community, which is I don't think she's actively, like, I'm the law and I need to control people and force them to act right. I think she does come at it from a fairly sort of maternal, I hate using that word for every woman who has kids, but like she comes at it from a place of like, this is a time for you to pause and reflect. Do you want to continue down this path? And she knows oftentimes when she's dealing with someone who is in the throes of addiction, they don't have a choice or they haven't yet hit the point where they're going to have to make that choice. But I think she does come at it from almost like not of course with the guy where she's trying to hunt down who's kidnapped two teenage girls, but with the more mundane policing of it, of like, I'm going to force you to stop where you are and notice the paths in front of you. And I think that's a really healthy way of looking at community policing. If you were integral to the community in this tiny little town, you know, you're not so much declaring what is or is not correct action, but you are saying what you are doing is affecting all of us in this tiny little place. Do you want to continue affecting everyone you know and presumably love in the way that you are doing it? And I think that that's shown fairly well in this, which is also like a really sort of revolutionary way of looking at policing and the role in community, especially in America, where we always have top down cops. We're going to bust the bad guy and remove him so everybody stays pure. And that's just not what's happening here.
Absolutely. And I think partially it must just be like a coping strategy for having to be like have this role of knowing everybody so intimately. But also, as you were talking, it reminded me a lot about The Wire. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
watched The Wire, but there's an arc of, I forget now, but they're the two sort of there's kind of street cops in, in Baltimore. And when we first meet them, they're chasing guys down and beating them up and acting cocky. And they sort of have this arc where they learn how to police their community in a way of getting to know people, talking to them, being visible, getting, like having personal relationships that transcend. Because then it feels like they're part of the community. They're not, this
Mhm.
outside force that's coming in to like strike the hammer of justice down. They are working with their communities to make them safer. And that, I agree, does feel like the path, potentially the path forward. Not being a genius about
Yeah. I only know
policing
so
at all,
much.
or knowing much about that, but it does feel good, I guess, when you see cops that take the time to get to know people and talk to them, and it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like they are just showing up
Yeah.
guns blazing and they're not afraid of their people that they're
Yeah.
protecting. So
Yeah. My friend Libby, who was on our first episode, is a massive Wire fan, and she's been trying to get me to watch it for ages, but I know it's going to be really, really intense. And she's been getting mad at me that I haven't watched it yet, but I will. Damn it, I will, because I know it's an incredibly intense show, and it's so well written, and it really held up as a sort of gold standard for how you deal with the story of inner city crime. And I do think, I'm glad that this is being set in a small town, but a small town with, interstates, a small town where there are strangers, a small town where there is industry, everybody has a trade, everybody's doing something. The high school is seemingly large, because I do think a lot of crime fiction has a fetishization of small town living. I've never lived in a place that was particularly small, so I just don't understand this sort of like real America is where, whatever. And I don't think this show falls into that trap.
yeah, it definitely doesn't make it seem cute. And I think part of that too is just also, I think in Pennsylvania, you're sort of close to cities. So yeah, there's this feeling like if you, have gas money, like you can get out and go shopping or go to the movies or something. So it's not really like we are, it's not made to be like Gilmore Girls Stars Hollow or
Yeah.
something like that
Yes.
or
Ugh.
whatnot, which I love, but for
Yeah.
different reasons. Yeah. Yeah.
And I do think another just absolute strength of this show, which we haven't really touched upon yet, is the fact that it is cast with some of the greatest actors working today. And I don't think the show would have been as successful as it is in all the nuanced ways that we've been discussing if it had been in the hands of, frankly, worse actors, because everybody in this show truly holds these people with just like absolute care and respect in a way that I would say a lot of shows don't.
I totally agree. Even just like I was like laughing a bit at the guy Pearce character. So he's like the writer in residence at like the local college who goes out
Yeah.
with Mare, which I thought was so funny just because I've done that job. And I was like, oh, it is sort of what you feel like. You come to town and you're sort of looking around and you're like, oh, like, what have I got myself into a little bit? And having him, and he like, it's kind of a bit part. Like he's only in maybe 10% of
Yeah.
the show.
He's there to be Guy Pearce, but he does a really good job of it.
Yeah, definitely. He's very handsome. You're sort of rooting for her to go out with him just because he has that power and charisma. But I totally agree with you because once in a while when I was watching, I was like, oh, like, is this line, like if I wrote this line that one of them is saying, if it wasn't said by one of these incredible actors, would it read as like a little hacky?
Yeah.
And even having this priest kind of at the end, I know I've mentioned this so many times, but do this sermon, like that in itself is like a bit like, well, kids, like here's the moral of the story. But there
Totally.
just really is something, I think, to the power of the acting, the specificity of the location that gives it, I think, like an extra layer where we sort of forgive it for some of its sins occasionally. But there is also just this like very kind of, and I don't want to be offensive, but goofy accent, right? Like there is a,
Poor accent.
yeah,
Yeah.
like I remember when it first came out, it was, you know, it was like 2021. We were all sort of in and out of lockdowns and navigating, you know, vaccines and all of the stuff that came with the early COVID pandemic. And it was just sort of fun to turn the show on. And, you know, they're like saying like hoagie and like, you know, are you going to go home? And it is just like such a
The worder.
regionally specific
The worder.
order.
Yeah.
I remember my partner at the time and I just all week would be like, hey, can you give me a glass of water? Like just to goof off. And it was nice to see the actors kind of commit, I think,
Yeah.
to that. Cause it was,
Yeah.
yeah, it made the show feel even more immersive and even more, like you said, like kind of oppressive in how tight we were, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. Like, honestly, Kate Winslet's work with that accent, again, I don't know the accent particularly well. I know people from there, but they don't have the accent. It is, again, another thing that's very class delineated as well. You know, like when you do go to Boston and you talk to people who are from sort of maybe outside the city on the north, their accent isn't as thick as it is if you're from the city or the south side of the city. So it is a very class delineated accent as well. What's really weird, and I'm just going to say this, is I don't like to shop there very often because their politics are bad. But when you do go to the Home Depot, for some reason, when you check out at the self checkout thing, the woman's voice that they recorded for the Home Depot self checkout has the Delco accent. And I don't understand why they made that decision. But yes, it's like, thank you for shopping at the Home Depot. And you're like, why? Where did that come from? It's very odd. But it's the only place I've ever heard that accent like out in the wild. And I don't understand why they made that decision. That being said, just Kate Winslet and Julianne Nicholson in a scene together is like, oh, thank you for getting two of the greatest working actresses of their generation in a room together. And then you throw in Jean Smart and just it's some of the most, I think, obviously Mare has to be carefully cast for something that is always on her shoulders, always in her head, always in her heart. It is a Mare focused show. But my God, is every woman around her just cast absolutely perfectly.
I would totally agree. Like it was just top down, genius level casting. I think we expect nothing less from HBO. They just
True.
seem like they know how to pick. I don't know how you do that. I don't know if you've ever tried to like fan cast your own novels. People always ask you, and I'm like, I don't know how you people do that. Like it's so hard.
Love it. Truthfully, like I often I don't necessarily cast from the very beginning of when I start to write something, but over time, my brain does sort of latch on to, I think, people who might be able to do it. Or I start to like include mannerisms. But I think that's genuinely one of the things that genuinely shocked me, though, is the fact that this was not based on a book and it was not adapted from anything because it's so rich. And I know you've written for television, so I don't necessarily want to be like, can you believe TV writers did this? But I was like,
No,
but I was honestly surprised that it didn't have a 400-page novel of lore and relationships to pull from because it is just that deep and every character is delivering that level of pathos to every character that they're playing.
I totally agree. Like when you think about when I've written scripts and when I've worked on shows and everything, like the how you get to know a character when you're writing a screenplay is hard. Like you kind of have to do a lot of writing that never matters almost
Mhm.
like just to get that sense that this person has like a fixed identity because yeah, it's like very, very the I think the struggle of it a little bit. And I think why a lot of the mystery of the week detective shows, like sometimes they feel a bit more like I'm just a, sort of non-specific cop type or something, right? Or you
Yeah.
fall into archetype a little bit. I mean, the specificity of these characters was incredible. And the actors certainly brought a lot to it, but you're right, it wasn't the writing. And something that I really admire about Maris' character is that she doesn't really get warmer. Like I think we
Yes.
sort of have that expectation with woman characters is that they are going to become more likable or something,
Yes.
right? As over the course of the series. And I think it's in this sense, it's just that we grew to respect and understand her a lot more.
Yeah.
Something I loved about the pilot is you're sort of set up to think that, Mare is a mess and she's not good at her job and she's sort of running around and she's got all of this very layered backstory and everybody's mad at her and she's a failure as a detective because one of her, the women on her basketball team, her daughter has been missing for a year. And Mare is sort of facing now having the investigation that I think she had to close because she couldn't really get anywhere with it reopen with a new detective coming to sort of supervise her. And you see all of this go down at the 25th anniversary celebration for their
Yes.
state championship basketball team where they're
Yeah.
like fighting before they run out to be heralded and celebrated. And there was just like so many interesting dynamics in that scene. Such a great scene to watch if you just want to, did like geek out about the like layers of conflict that exist
Yes.
between all of these people. But what I loved is that we're sort of like immediately after, we're like, no, we learn in the next few episodes, Mare is a really great detective. Like she finds a bullet fragment in she manipulates the state cop and she finds, she is desperate to find the evidence of where the bullet shot had been hit. She finds incredibly small details and is able to just maybe with a slight amount of luck, but I think just
Yeah.
like the persistence and being really, really good at her job. And so we get this like reversal. Like if you're a writer nerd, a reversal is really, really interesting. So you think one thing and then in the next few episodes that's sort of turned upside down. And that all makes us, as the person watching it, be like, oh, they really are screwed. Like this
Yeah.
is an unsolvable crime.
Yeah.
Because this person that I thought sucked at her job is actually really good at it. And it just means that, they're gonna need to have they end up having a break in the case
Yeah.
later because someone else is kidnapped. But yeah, it's very, compelling just on like a structural nerdy scene level for
Oh, it
anybody
really
watching it.
is.
Yeah.
No, they do so much with the character because, you want her at the beginning, like your own deep, sociological misogyny sets in where you're just like, well, she's just an angry woman and she's just like such a mess because there are a lot of books now. And I do have to admit that like really love messy women, but they never get, they're I love your book because she's messy for a very specific reason and to
Yeah.
a very specific end.
Mhm.
But there are a lot of books now where it's just like, I'm just messy, and it's like, are you messy or are you 35 and 17 at the same time? Like, is there gravity to the mess? And I do, and I love messy characters that have a, a weight to the chaos that they're spewing around. And I think Mare is very good at having just her life is in shambles. She has lived through some of the worst things that a human being, let alone a mother, can live through. And it's having such an incredible dark hole sort of like black matter effect on her family. Her daughter is you find out what her daughter has been dealing with for the last couple of years of having found her brother, and she's just like she's holding that against Mare. And Mare doesn't know. Like, she really is not aware. She's so in her own grief that she does not acknowledge her daughter's grief. And she's parentified her daughter thoroughly to take care of the grandson. Like, I know her mother is there, but her daughter is like, no, let me put him to bed. Let me take care of him. And it's just like she's turned her daughter into a teen mother. And that's not fair to her at all.
There's just a ton of richness in all
Yeah.
of the relationships that exist between them. And you see how her daughter, because like we learn, from our parents and our grandparents, we learn sort of how to be. And she, I think, like her mother, feels like she has to be this like very strong, capable. She's very put together. She's like trendy and like a queer. I'm not sure what her orientation is, but she dates women and she's got kind of like, she's got like a cool haircut and like, but
Yeah.
she's very put together and you see her processing grief through art, but you also really just see her not until the end. You don't really get the sense of the weight that she's also carrying.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we can see the richness, I think, in these characters through their relationships for
And
sure.
again, as a show that's written by a man in his 40s,
I know I'm
this
mad.
I know. He has so much empathy for teen girls that you never see on television. Her daughter, Mare's daughter, has such a sense of self-worth. She breaks up with her crappy, awful girlfriend at a certain point, and she starts dating another girl who brings out just joy and happiness. And then for the character that gets murdered in the first episode. My husband watched that episode with me and he was just like, do you get the sense that the writer said that like maybe her dying was a relief and a for almost like a good thing that happened to her because
Oh,
everything
because of
that was
how
being set
bad
up
her
for
life
her
is. Yeah.
was misery. Her father is abusive. Her mother is nowhere. She's got this sick kid that she can't take care of. The ex that she's parading as the father of her child is with this abusive, horrible person. He won't help out in any conceivable way. And then the baby was conceived through incest. And you're just like, yeah, I think the writer really wanted to let us know that maybe death was a forgiveness for this poor girl because life was not ever going to be kind to her.
It was a very, very dark character arc for her. And what I really do admire about how the show was written was that we get, it adheres to sort of the crime fiction. We need a mystery right away, and that we learn that there's a missing young woman that Mare hasn't found, and that it gives you that sense right away that there will be an investigation. But then we spend an entire episode with Erin McMiniman, who's the
Yes, thank
young
you.
woman who dies, and she's killed at the end of the first episode, and so we are deeply connected with her. She gets a ton of, there's a ton of story for her on the screen, and so she doesn't just feel like a dead woman that a detective's, going to solve the murder to make themselves
Right.
feel good, which is, I think, an old trope of crime fiction that I hate. Right? It's just
Yeah,
that like how
exactly.
many young women have to die for these mysteries to, be solved or whatever, right? It just starts to feel really yucky. And I didn't watch there was a Netflix show called Adolescence that a lot of people really loved, but the major critique, I think, is that they really gave no space for the victim in that show. And it
Yeah.
just feels like, again, like a woman just has to die for a young man to like learn a lesson. And that
Yeah.
is totally messed up. And so I think if we want a model for like really great empathetic storytelling, because young women are, oftentimes victims in these situations for sure, then this is a great one. I think if you're, watching this podcast and you're like, well, how do I do it? I think this was like kind of perfectly done in a way,
Yeah.
right? Where you're
Yeah.
like, you get to know her as a person with, hopes and dreams and conflict. And, she's like a human being, which,
Yeah.
everyone.
Because you are led to believe in the first episode that the worst thing that's going to happen to her is that she actually gets kidnapped like the other girl. And it's actually like, oh no, like something far worse and far more horrendous actually happens to her. I do think that the incredible, narrative twist of bringing in a much younger male detective to help Mare, played by Evan Peters, is just such a wonderful, realistic slap in the face for Mare to actually kind of refocus and re-energize her entire MO for this because again and throughout the first couple of episodes she's just like, we're never going to find this girl, she's dead, dead at the bottom of the river, we're never going to find her, like I want to find her, I'm putting up have you seen her posters, like in the back of my mind I was sure maybe this false Catholic hope that I'm going to rescue this girl, but she's really given up by the time that they bring in Evan Peters' character. And then she's like, I can't let him do it. No, this is my friend's daughter. This is my connection. This is my town. And I'm going not necessarily be the hero, but I can't let him sort of get this investigation because these aren't his people. They're not his
Yeah.
his community.
Absolutely. And then like that again is like, I think a trope, like kind of a trope, right? It's like, oh,
Mhm.
you're bringing in the FBI or something, right? Or you're bringing in someone from the outside. But I think you're right by creating this like new character dynamic that we haven't seen very often, which is like the older, more experienced, more personally invested cop with like a younger guy is really interesting. And I think they have those two like there's such an interesting connection between them. I love the episode where they go on a date and he's trying to make her feel romantic, and you can tell that she is there. I don't know if it's totally because she is, he's her kind of connection to the case, but there is, I think, a strong, sense that she really just wants to work and he's kind of more romantic. And I think that can be true in relationships between men and women. So it's fun to see it play
Absolutely.
out. Yeah.
And I think her heart breaks a little bit when she realizes he still lives with his mother.
Yeah.
And she, all of a sudden she's going like, "Oh, well, my son isn't around," and that's truly what like just completely dissects her away from that emotional, that romantic connection that she might have felt a little bit of a spark for him, where she's just like, oh no, like this is not the feelings that I need to be having towards someone right now. And then when he dies, is murdered, I think that it's such, I think it actually gives us a twist on what you were saying of like the propulsion for the characters. So often a dead young girl lying naked at a river. Whereas I think the wonderful propulsion for her is now like essentially she's lost two boys. And I don't often, often we have this conversation online now of like, ooh, creepy boy moms, creepy boy moms. And it's like, yeah, there are some moms out there that are really weird towards their sons. But I think also just like that, when you expect, we get a lot of narratives about women and their daughters, but this is a truly heartfelt, exploration of losing a son because she still has her girl, but and she's got a little boy again that she has to raise and take care of. And that lost 20 something male is now grown even more importance in how we understand culture.
Absolutely. And, like not to be sort of icky, but I do think, part of why she's drawn to him is probably because he's around the same age as her son who passed
Yeah.
away, right? There is like a sense of, maybe I could save, help him
Hmm.
or save him too. And then in that, moment, like her sort of like all is lost moment, her really like her bleakest point is after he dies because, she couldn't save him. And I also think like she's fighting, there's a whole plot line about how hard she's fighting to have custody of her grandson.
Yeah.
And I think a huge part of that just comes from her, need to get it right. I think
Hmm.
there's a feeling that she's like, oh, if I just, fight for him and take care of him and, whatnot, like then he, I can get it right this time, which is like a very wounded, multi-layered, probably kind of tangled up with her grief and her,
Yeah.
I think part of her, character arc is like learning to kind of like let that go and accept that like her son had like, inherited mental illness from her father, right? There was like kind of like some genetic things and you just
Hmm.
can't control that. And so
Yeah.
kind of accepting that she had no control over it was, I think, really foundational to her kind of like forgiving herself.
And I think this is also really just well done in the text of the show, in that even now we're seeing younger girls who like know their path because, second wave feminism did do a pretty okayish job of raising us, of being like, you can be anything you want to be, focus, keep your nose to the grindstone, work really hard. You will get far in life if you actually do this. And that is a lesson for white lower middle class to middle class women, of just being like, you can work your way out of this, you can work your way to a better life. And we're seeing now that that's by and large fairly true for a lot of white women of a certain age from a certain socioeconomic class. And her daughter is just the perfect embodiment of that. And I think that Mare is really struggling with something that we are only now really talking about 4 or 5 years later, which is that, like, why aren't the boys still living up to any kind of potential? Every guy in this of a certain age in this show is kind of a wayward dirtbag. And you're just kind of like, why is the girl escaping? Why is this beautiful young woman doing so well? And why does she understand the gravity of it? Whereas the men are so lost at a certain point.
Yeah, there is like a moment where Mare's ex-husband she kind of accuses him of potentially being in a relationship with the young woman who dies in the first episode, Erin McMenamin. So she like, and we sort of think like this husband must be involved in this. And, because we're kind of on Mare's side at that point.
Yeah.
And then he's exonerated pretty soon after. And at
Thank
the end,
God.
we sort of, yeah, sorry?
Thank God,
Yeah, oh, right? You're like, oh my gosh. And it is kind of a relief just to be like, oh, like he can be a teacher and a father and he's getting married and he's picking out a goofy tuxedo. And there is like a sense of like, okay, so it did kind of like work out for like one man in
one
this.
guy. Yeah. One guy is okay.
The odds are not great. And, he's certainly not, I think, portrayed as like a perfect person, but it did show that, yeah, there was like, I felt like that was like a very specific choice that the writer made to kind of show that, I think, at the end and give us a sense. But you're right, there is like a real sense of just like how, difficult it is for folks to, claw their way out of poverty and the sort of oppressive power of capitalism and how determined and focused you have to be and the sort of support that you need around you in order to do it.
Yeah.
And, Yeah. I like to think Siobhan, the mayor's daughter, went on to be like a great filmmaker because
God, I hope
you
so.
want there to be a happy ending, right?
Yeah,
You
for
want to
one
picture
of
Mayor at
them.
like the Oscars or something.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
found it really interesting that they let Guy Pearce's character leave. You know what I mean? Like, I understand that those sort of visiting professor sort of situations, they are temporary. You do move on to another one, hopefully, if you get another job. But I thought it was really interesting that, it could maybe considered a sort of self-insert for the gentleman who wrote this, who also was raised in a lower in class town in Eastern Pennsylvania. And it could perhaps be construed that way, that like only the arts will let you leave. But I do think that there is a certain aspect of like the freedom of thought, of just like, if you can imagine, and this is going to sound so hokey, but like, if you can imagine yourself living a better life, if you can imagine yourself living a different life, you might actually be able to live a different life. And there is that aspect to it. But like, then there's also just the aspect of like, he's Guy Pearce. Of course he's going to go somewhere else. Like, look at him.
Yeah, I know. I can relate because I works this like he's doing going to do like a sessional contract at a university or like an adjunct, I think is what they call it in the States. So I can relate to this a little bit. What I liked about the ending is Siobhan has a moment where like I think Mare says something like, "Oh, I hate this town," and Siobhan's like, "No, you love it." And like then the sun comes out in the room and there's something to
Yeah.
we get this like this feeling of like hope and optimism. I just said
Hope.
optimism about the future and about how Mare actually maybe does. She says the entire time that like this place is a shithole and I hate it and blah 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 and like no one can get out of here and it's the worst. But maybe there is some love for home in it. And I did kind of like, I don't know, maybe I just like, I'm not a romantic. I don't know. I kind of like that he left only because I felt like the ending was very much just about how like life has like kind of like a churn to it. Like there's sort of an endless coming and going with people and relationships and friends. And that, sometimes you'll go through really dark and difficult periods and other times the sunlight will come out and you'll get kind of like almost like a reprieve from it.
Yeah.
And that maybe a sense though too, like we kind of just need to surrender to a higher power and we don't have control over of it. I don't know. I don't want to sound too like I'm not religious or anything.
No, I know. But,
Yeah.
I think a lot of narrative often believes, like, especially in crime fiction, I think we have a tendency to sort of say, like, once this is all over, everything will get better. Crime fiction really does have a finality to it. Even when we talk about romance and, from the romance novel expectation that there's a happily ever after and that the story goes on and that they're always going to be happy. Whereas I think crime fiction often has the belief that this has a final end point to it. And we find out who the guilty person is, they go to jail or they get their punishment for whatever it may be. And I think that this show is so well done in that life doesn't end. And, I think Mare has thought that her life had no momentum since her son passed away, of just she's been left in this sort of hamster wheel purgatory of chasing after a missing girl who she doesn't think is ever going to be found. Her husband, her ex-husband lives in the house behind her, so they're still in each other's lives. Her kid isn't getting older. Like what this absolute firm belief in the myth that her story isn't going to change. And I do think it's wonderful that she's given this guy who she cares for and who makes her happy, but he's got to go. And, and it's not sad because she's an adult and she's experienced far worse loss in her life. And it dawns on her that it's cyclical and that life moves and that it isn't over until it's over. And there's a really, like you're saying, like it could be construed as like naively uplifting for a very bleak show. Or I think it's in crime fiction, that's what gives us the opportunity for her to tackle yet another project. And unfortunately, this is not going to get another season. This is a finite thing. But, it did give you hope that there could be another season of Mare of Easttown to see Mare grow and Mare change and her family, live on.
Yeah, I know. And I'm kind of glad I think there wasn't another season. I know like I love the show and I remember when it ended I was like, "Oh, I need another one. I need it now." But I'm sort of glad that they didn't go back to it just because I think the character it was very much like I think the story was the story of her character was told. And so I think they'd have to find like a new way in somehow.
Yeah.
But I know the writer did another show called Task, I think. I haven't watched it yet, but I don't know if it was called Task, but Mark Ruffalo is the guy, is the lead. So
Wonderful. Mark
yeah,
Ruffalo is
I
delightful.
think.
Yes,
Oh
it
my
is
gosh,
called
I'm just
Task.
saying this now, but I'm
No,
like,
it is.
okay.
It's another Mark Ruffalo is an FBI agent. So looks a little bit to be a bit more run and gunning and a little bit more action oriented. But, again, cast is really fantastic. Mark Ruffalo, Tom Pelphrey, and a bunch of other people who Martha Plimpton's in a couple episodes. So bunch of really, really phenomenal casting. And HBO, man, like they're
I
losing a little bit
know.
of shine to Apple TV right now, but fingers crossed HBO can pull it out
I
because
know, I hope so, yeah. There was what was also wild to me when I was watching this, because I didn't make the connection, but the woman who plays Mare's best friend, who is the mother of
the little
the
boy, Julianne Nicholson, yeah.
so she plays, I don't know if you watch Hacks, she's like Dance
I
Mom,
haven't.
isn't she?
Yes, she is. She's one of my favorite actresses. I don't know why, but like whenever she's on screen, I'm like, Julianne Nicholson, you just absolute goddess. And she really doesn't work as much as you'd expect for someone who's just that supremely talented.
It was very, very good, and I was like, "Oh, now I need to," because 'cause I've seen, because Hacks is a comedy, and it's a
Hmm.
pretty straight comedy, like, and she plays, like, a very outrageous Canadian character.
Awesome.
She's like a TikTok influencer, named Dance Mom, I think, who, like,
Amazing.
dances on
As soon
Mare.
as Jean Smart showed up again, I went, right, it was this show that gave us Jean Smart, like the Jean Smart renaissance that we've been
Yeah.
able to live
Oh,
through and gloriously lived through for the last couple of
yeah, because
years.
I think was oh, no, never mind, I was confusing her in my mind with Allison Janney. I feel like they maybe occupy a similar.
Yeah, very
They probably
similar
have
casting.
competed for parts before. But anyway, yeah,
Probably.
just love
Yeah.
Jean Smart also. She was so funny. There was a moment where I just did it again. I said moment. She pulls out a bag of frozen vegetables from the freezer, and then she opens it, and inside is a Haagen-Dazs. And you're
Yes.
like, "Oh my god, this is such a funny character thing," because she obviously is hiding it from everyone else because she doesn't want them to eat her ice cream. It's so good, and I just love moments like that where you're like, "Oh, this is like a real person." They
Yeah.
really thought about, yeah,
That's someone
who.
who's been a mom for a really long time. And you're just like, yeah, someone pulled that from their own mother. And when their mother saw that on television, they went, how could you do that to me?
Simple pleasures, I guess.
Exactly. Thank you so much for talking about this show with me because I don't think anybody else would have been brave enough to choose it because it is just so it's such a close and gothic television show that I think that it's a real masterclass in how to write television and how to translate crime fiction towards the towards serialized television. Thank you so much for choosing it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was so fun, and, yeah, I know, I think I didn't remember how dark it was before I picked it, but no, it was just, like, so I love character-driven storytelling, and so I felt like we could really dive into how that can how you can still play within the kinda confines of the crime fiction genre with still kind of giving very meaty and interesting
Yeah.
and deeply sad character
Yeah.
development. Yeah.
Tropes are just structure. That's all they are. It's just, it's the jungle gym on which you play. And this show does it phenomenally well. How can everybody keep in touch with you, your work, the books that you have out?
Absolutely, yeah. So my most recent book was She's a Lamb, and it is I think we're actually currently sold out in the States, but it's going to its third reprint, which is exciting, and it should be stocked up. But yeah, order from your indies, order from, I'm in the States, I think it's bookshop.org where you
Hmm.
can, I know it's in stock there. And my first novel is called Other People's Secrets. Might be starting to get tough to get a hold of that one, but so if you want to check it out, it is a character driven mystery about the sort of wayward employees at a summertime resort.
That's
And it
awesome.
has its own sort of kind of, darkly funny, campy energy to it as well. I mostly hang out on Instagram, so you can find me at Meredith Hambrock Books. And then we talked about the podcast, and that's the Novel Writers Podcast. Available where you get your podcasts, I hope. And yeah, we have an Instagram account as well. And yeah, would love you to check us out. And yeah, thanks for having me. This is super interesting. I want to say fun, but I was like, I don't know, I'm
Yeah,
sad.
I know.